mean, I thought the movie was pretty terrific, but in fact it was almost a carbon copy of the stage performance, and in that sense it was a little too theatrical. Howard Sackler, who wrote the play, also wrote the screenplay, and perhaps that was a mistake, I don't know. It wasn't opened up sufficiently. And I think that Ed Sheeran, who directed it and who is my husband now, I think he did such an impressive job with the stage production. It was hard to divorce yourself from the images. And although Marty Ritt did a fine job with the screenplay, as I say, it wasn't virtually different than the play.
Before I start, a general spoiler warning regarding the plot of The Great White Hope. When you mention politics in the context of this year's Best Actress race, the name you most likely think of is Glenda Jackson. And for good reasons. After all, she completely abandoned her acting profession in 1992 to serve as a member of the British Parliament for more than 20 years. And honestly, any excuse to post her speech dragging Margaret Thatcher after her death.
Greed, selfishness, no care for the weaker, sharp elbows, sharp knees, they were the way forward.
Seriously, it's on YouTube and you don't want to miss this. But Jane Alexander is another performer whose personal political beliefs not only shaped her entire life, but also the choices she made as an actress. She explained her political awakening as, "I swear I came out of my mother's womb as a Democrat. I was liberal from a very early age."
They used to say things to me like congressmen would say, well, you know, what are you going to choose? You're going to choose breast cancer or the arts? I said, we can fund them both. We're talking about one of the greatest countries in the earth. What are you talking about? We can fund it all. We need to reduce the defense budget.
Her activism maybe didn't draw the same kind of attention as that of actresses like Jane Fonda or Vanessa Redgrave, but she quietly showed her positions in the parts she played and the movies she was involved in. From stories about political scandals, the downfall of the nuclear family and reshaping of women's identities, to the complete destruction of our life as we know it. For her, it was important to be an actress who did her work in a way that it would mean and say something about the world we live in.
Art is politics. I'm not talking about slogans or necessarily banners or anything like that. I'm just talking about
or didactic material that you...
But an artist has something to say. If they don't have something to say, then what is art? I mean, why do it? Well, let's just go out and look at the moon.
Right.
So I've never separated who I am from what I do in my work.
And the intensity of her talent certainly helped her to achieve this goal. A talent that gave silent strength to many of her roles, enabling her to become women who suffer, who fight, who accept, who rebel, and who keep their own identity. An 80s profile of Jane Alexander described her as, "More than perhaps any other performer, Jane Alexander has brought to the stage and screen a vast range of conscientious, strong-willed women, role models so to speak, for an age desperately in need of them. Quiet dignity and rectitude are the hallmarks of all her portrayals."
What do we wish for, Mom? That we remember it all. The good and the awful.
The idea to use acting and performing as an outlet for her inner beliefs came to Jane Alexander very early in her life, and she decided to become an actress at the age of 9. In 5th grade, generally described as a tomboy and a, quote, nature girl, she played Long John Silver in a school production of Treasure Island.
I was in every school play I could possibly get into. I was in community theater. I went to summer stock several seasons as a teenager.
As Jane Alexander recalls, her parents would also never discourage her ambitions, and they reinforced my feelings about my talent. I never had to overcome prejudices to be an actress.
Well, you're right. I did do a summer at the New Loeb Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yes. Faye Dunaway and I were in a fledgling company, and we did a summer there. And then I came to New York pretty quickly. I was a ski bum for several months, deciding what to do with my life, and I came to New York pretty quickly and got work for an agent, a theatrical agent, as a Girl Friday. And he didn't help me. But I did a lot of workshop productions, yes, and off Broadway, And then I got a standby for Sandy Dennis in 1,000 Clowns.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I was able to work with Jason Robards, because Sandy was out a couple of times.
Right.
And then Dane Clark, who took over. And that was the beginning. And then I decided that I wanted to go out of town, which was a big move in those days.
Absolutely.
Because most actors waited for the big break in New York City.
Absolutely.
But I knew somewhere that what I wanted to do with my life was really dedicated to the theater, ideally a life like Catherine Cornell had had, where she would do a show in New York and then take it on the road
tour,
for
yes.
a year.
And so Jane Alexander went to Washington and successfully auditioned for the role of Joan of Arc at the Arena stage. Her husband Robert Alexander would also be a part of the company and founded the Living Stage, an interracial improvisational theater, in 1966.
How can there be revolution when you are divided? Go!
The permanent engagement at the company would subsequently change Jane Alexander's life forever. For one, working in the capital of the United States allowed her to truly combine her passion for acting with her political interests. At the Arena stage, she would appear as Joan of Arc and in productions of Macbeth or The Crucible by night, while protesting against the war in Vietnam by day.
I was doing what I wanted to do, which was the classics, and a lot of new plays as well. And I loved being a company member. I loved living in Washington. I loved Arena Stage. Everything about it was perfect, and bringing up my child and in Washington was great.
And second, in 1967, the Arena stage also gave her that big important break every actress dreams of, with a role that was not only challenging from an artistic point of view, but also gave her the opportunity to comment on the past and present of racism in American society.
Racism is a form of insanity. And unfortunately, giving it a name almost sanctions it. Makes it sort of, we understand that. We don't understand it.
The Great White Hope is based on the life and career of black box fighter Jack Johnson. Check out the documentary Unforgivable, Blackness, The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson if you want to learn more about him, but here are the most relevant facts. Essentially, Jack Johnson was an American boxer. However, this would be like just saying Sidney Poitier was an American actor, because it skips the bigger picture about what his success as an African American meant in connection to the structural and systematic racism in the United States. In 1908, Jack Johnson became the first African American world heavyweight champion. As you can imagine, his success turned into an identity crisis for white people across the country, and Jack Johnson became the, quote, most famous and the most notorious African American man on earth, and a danger to the current order. Johnson was, as newspapers said, not just black, but unapologetically black, and he made it very clear that he didn't care about the very real written and unwritten rules about the separation of black and white, and especially his marriages to various white women caused additional outrages everywhere. Putting Johnson into his place became a holy mission for countless white Americans, and they turned to former and by that point retired heavyweight champion James Jeffries to reclaim the title and demonstrate the superiority of the white race. James Jeffries was their great white hope. The match between Johnson and Jeffries was referred to as the fight of the century and seen as the ultimate referendum on racial superiority. And to the shock and fury of millions, the great white hope failed. And the outcome was not even close. James Jeffries himself later admitted that, "I couldn't have whipped Johnson at my best. No, I couldn't have reached him in 1,000 years." Johnson's victory over Jeffries led to riots across the country that killed around 24 people, and the recordings of the fight were banned in many US states. Unable to defeat Johnson in the boxing ring, he was then arrested 2 times in 1912 for violating the Mann Act for transporting women across the state lines for immoral purposes, and found guilty in 1913. Johnson would avoid jail time by fleeing the country and living in exile for the next 7 years, but running out of money, he eventually returned to the US and spent almost 1 year in prison. Johnson would then continue to fight, but his age began to catch up with him over the years, and he died in 1946 from the consequences of a car crash. It's clear that a story like Jack Johnson's was destined to be recreated in one way or another someday. And what better political climate to bring this project to life than the 1960s?
This was the height of the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael's Black Power, Black is Beautiful, was a signature slogan of the time.
The time was clearly right for a play about Jack Johnson, especially as 1967, the year of its premiere, also saw the US Supreme Court decision Loving versus Virginia, which outruled laws banning interracial marriages. The Great White Hope was just as much influenced by the time in which it was written as by the time it was set in, a commentary on racism now and then, as well as the struggles and the fight for acceptance of interracial couples. Ed Sheeran, who directed The Great White Hope on the stage and would become Jane Alexander's second husband in 1975, said the play was about a man who moves out of his tribe and has to pay for it. A tragic hero who was seen with nothing but disdain by a majority of white people, while many African Americans rejected him for causing unnecessary trouble and not staying within his own community.
The scene was a tragedy. America was a tragedy that it couldn't cope with him. And I'd say, on a lesser degree, America was a tragedy in terms of race and racism.
The part of Jack Johnson would eventually be cast with James Earl Jones, who had already been acting for a good 15 years but, like Jane Alexander, had his big breakthrough with The Great White Hope. And both performers would be highly appreciative of their experiences together. James Earl Jones later called Jane one of the greatest English-speaking actresses, and she would remember him as one of her favorite co-stars.
The Great White Hope was one of the new plays that was being done in my third season there. And I was asked to play Eleanor Bachman in it, and they brought James Earl Jones in from New York to play Jack Jefferson, i.e. Jack Johnson.
Right. Was he the only person from the outside the company who was brought in, or were some others brought in?
Oh, I think we brought in some others of the older men. Yes.
But basically, it was the Arena Stage company.
Absolutely.
As is always the case, various parts of Jack Johnson's life were altered for the retelling of his story. Most of all, due to legal reasons, Jack Johnson became Jack Jefferson in the play, and significant changes were also made in regards to Jane Alexander's character, Jack's love interest and wife Eleanor Bachman. Jane Alexander called her an amalgam of Jack Johnson's different real-life wives. Like his first wife Etta, Eleanor is very introvert and dies by suicide due to depression, the public condemnation for her marriage, but also the both mental and physical abuse by Jack Johnson. But most of her relevance in the plot is based on Johnson's second wife, Lucille Cameron, as it was the relationship with her that got him arrested for violating the Mann Act, and she would also accompany him during his years in exile. For Jane Alexander, The Great White Hope was the kind of project she had dreamed about since deciding to become an actress, and she cherished the controversial nature of the project, saying, "I don't know whether there was something in me that translated that I was political and socially conscious when I was a young actress, because these roles came to me. And I was so grateful to have them, to be a part of that." The Great White Hope stage premiere fit right into the time when artistic projects about race relations reached a creative and commercial peak. Hallelujah Baby won a Tony for Best Musical, In the Heat of the Night won the Oscar for Best Picture, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was one of the biggest box office hits of the year, and one of the first big movies to deal with interracial relationships. It is therefore not surprising that The Great White Hope became an overwhelming success in Washington, and interest in the play was so high that the production would move to a Broadway engagement just a short time after its arena stage premiere. And The Great White Way welcomed The Great White Hope with open arms and never-ending standing ovations.
It was the first one to come from regional theater. It was also a play that was addressing the issues of the time,
yes,
which had to do with civil rights and
race relations.
Race relations. It was the height of the Black Power movement.
Yes.
1967-68. It was very topical.
Yes.
New York critics called the play a walloping tragicomic drama, a galvanic triumph of emotions, and a superbly imaginative play, sociological valid without a shallow message, and The Great White Hope made the biggest impact on Broadway since Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, winning a Tony Award and a Pulitzer Prize, and attracting many famous personalities of the time.
And Muhammad Ali, who had been Cassius Clay before, and won the belt, and then had it taken away from him,
yes, that's
because
right. He refused to
sign up and go to Vietnam. So it was a very topical play because they took the belt away from Jack Johnson in the play. And as a matter of fact, it was Muhammad Ali's favorite play.
Well,
and he came three times.
Did he really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
He said, "This is my story, except for that white chick."
Namely you.
Yeah, namely me.
With all this praise, the central performances by Jones and Alexander were obviously not overlooked. While most reviewers naturally focused their attention on the central, larger-than-life work by James Earl Jones, Jane Alexander was also greatly admired for her performance that turned her into an overnight Broadway success comparable to Julie Harris in The Mem of the Wedding or Judy Holliday in Born Yesterday. The New York Times called her bright as a sparrow and with an almost spiritual beauty that makes her a wonderful foil for Mr. Jones, a kind of frail and defiantly loving Desdemona to his 20th century Othello. And other critics stated that she played her part with vitality and truth seldom seen in any of the creative arts.
Oh, Jack, it gets awful, doesn't it?
I don't know about that. Seems to me it gets worse and better both at once.
Is there anything I can do?
Yeah. You stick around and don't ever call me daddy.
While the critics clearly adored Jane Alexander, she had a tougher time with audiences, but not due to her acting. She remembered that black audience members would often openly resent her character. They yelled, "You idiot," at James when he married me. And who could blame them? I was causing him all these problems. So they would sometimes cheer or laugh at my death. It was extraordinary to feel the emotion coming across the footlights.
And this was very difficult for Jimmy to take because, first of all, he loved me as the character, and second of all, he felt that the audience did not fully understand what the love relationship was about, if they could cheer my death. So that made it real difficult for him particularly. It was easier for me, except I was lying there dead sometimes for 5 to 10 minutes while Jimmy dealt with the audience's response. He would stop and he would talk to them. He would be very angry.
Many white people, on the other hand, did not only have a problem with Jane Alexander's character, but with Jane Alexander herself, and she regularly received hate mail to her dressing room and was followed home various times after the play. She remembered, "Sometimes there were just disgusting letters from white bigots, male and female. Really awful letters. I considered the writers sick."
There was a lot of polarization in the country about race relations. As you may remember, civil rights movement and everything had been going on. Martin Luther King was about to be assassinated. And James Earl and myself were the first interracial couple to lie in a bed on stage together in a play. We had our clothes on, and the scene closed with a kiss. I got a lot of hate mail.
It doesn't change what you do, but every once in a while I'd have a nightmare about being shot on stage or something. I think that comes with the territory, any public figure.
For many years, a successful play on Broadway would immediately catch the attention of Hollywood for a possible movie version. While the close connection between Hollywood and Broadway slowly declined during the 70s, the success of other movies focusing on race relations in the last couple of years made The Great White Hope an immediate favorite for a big screen adaptation. James Earl Jones was maybe not a star by this point, but he had worked in movies before and was so closely associated with the role of Jack Johnson or Jefferson that his casting in the movie version was completely expected. Jane Alexander, on the other hand, without any experiences in movies yet and despite her acclaim, with far less name recognition at this point, seemingly had to watch another actress take over her role. Among those considered were Joanne Woodward and Faye Dunaway, but both of them declined. Joanne Woodward telling the producers to cast, quote, "the girl who did it on Broadway instead." And then this happened.
Jane Alexander.
The Tony win and Jane Alexander's acceptance speech on national television increased her visibility drastically, and one day after the ceremony, the movie role was hers.
But the truth was, Faye Dunaway turned the role down. I thank her to this day.
However, not everyone involved with the Broadway production was invited to Hollywood. Most visibly director Ed Sheeran, who was replaced by Martin Ritt, who had already directed performers to Oscar success before, and would do it again. For him, The Great White Hope was also the chance to tell a story he hadn't been able to tell before. When he had directed Hut in 1963, the part of Elmer Brown was played by white actress Patricia Neal, even though the character was African American in the original novel Horsemen Pass By. Rich had thought that audiences were not ready yet to see a relationship like this on the screen, and that theaters in the South would most likely not play the movie, but he felt that times had changed in the last few years, and that The Great White Hope would be significant for the entire country, saying, "The important thing is Southern theaters can now book it." When The Great White Hope finally premiered as a movie in October 1970, it became clear that, while some celebrated Broadway productions are just as acclaimed on the big screen, others failed to capture the essence of their success.
Now, then you made the movie. I didn't get as involved with you in the movie as I did on stage. Can you tell me why?
For The Great White Hope, it seems that the movie version was basically at the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a sense of racism fatigue, so to speak, and message pictures about race relations no longer caught the same kind of attention as a couple of years earlier. Basically, many reviewers and moviegoers felt that the movie was no longer necessary, because, after all, racism was over. We just had a whole decade of civil rights movement.
That totally worked, and now everything's fine.
Jane Alexander would also say in an interview, if this film had been made 2 years ago, it might have seemed more relevant. This is obviously not to say that she too thought that racism was over, but she recognized that the interest in stories like The Great White Hope had peaked. Moreover, the setting of the story in the time around World War I also reduced the appeal of the movie for many compared to contemporary stories like In the Heat of the Night or Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Everyone involved with The Great White Hope therefore constantly pointed at the interracial relationship at its center as a relevant topic for today, and one that was only partially examined by the motion picture industry so far. Jane Alexander said, "I think it is more important today as a story of two people who saw a strong relationship destroyed by the prejudices of our culture." However, even beyond the fact that the message of The Great White Hope did not make the same kind of impact anymore, the movie version was also criticized simply on a technical level, many reviewers calling it stagey or downright cheap looking, a clumsily realized motion picture lacking a truly engaging implementation. Of course, some reviews also complimented the movie, but in the end, The Great White Hope became a critical and financial disappointment.
When you transfer a play to film, most of the time it's written by a screenwriter, and Howard Sackler had written some screenplays, but he was so close to the play, and they hired him to do the screen version as well, and the dialogue was virtually the same. So you can see it's a highly theatrical piece, and Martin Ritt didn't really, my husband, who was not my husband then, Ed Sheeran directed the Broadway play, and it was an enormous, Tony's, Pulitzer Prize, everything. And
this was an unusual subject for Martin Ritt, who was usually a very naturalistic director.
Exactly. But it's virtually Ed's version of the play on stage, on screen.
Both James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander also considered the movie version of The Great White Hope inferior to the stage version. Jane Alexander felt that the movie missed some of the lyricism in the beautiful long monologues that some of the actors had. They were cut, a lot of them.
I read it one night and I came back and I said, my goodness, it's a wonderful play, but it sure ends peculiarly. And Ed said, that's just the first act. When we did the first reading of it, it was 7.5 hours long.
At Arena Stage, it ran 4.5 hours long. When it got to Broadway, it ran 3 hours long. When it got to the movie, it ran 1 hour and 30 minutes. So things are lost, but also the wonderful thing that we both got to do it, James Earl and I, right along the path for the next couple of years.
James Earl Jones was far more direct in his dislike of the movie version. I apologize for the film, because it wasn't right. They made a decision to shorten it by using a formula. They wanted to make it a romance. It was a mistake to try and ignore all the dynamic stuff going on in that man's life in favor of trying to make it a love story. But even if the reaction to The Great White Hope as a whole was mixed, the performances by James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander were still largely praised. Like it had happened on the stage, James Earl Jones again overshadowed everyone around him, and he received the lion's share of attention, but Jane Alexander still managed to make a strong impression, as her performance was called appealing, sad, noble and tragic. However, some critics also noted that the script was working against her, forcing her either to be overly sweet or too hysteric. It was therefore not surprising that the only awards attention The Great White Hope received in the end was for James Earl Jones and Jane Alexander. In regards to Jane, the media extensively covered her Cinderella story as the celebrated stage actress recreating her success on the big screen in her movie debut nomination, in the tradition of Julie Holliday, Shirley Booth, or the aforementioned Julie Harris. However, even with critical praise, many critics were skeptical of Jane Alexander's potential for a movie career, because, which is also a theme for this year, her looks did not fit the classic Hollywood star template. Articles about her included statements such as, if she wears makeup it's not apparent, less than a perfect nose, or hardly strikes one as Hollywood's idea of the girl.
Fuck you.
She was maybe an object of affection in The Great White Hope, but it was an unconventional story and therefore allowed an unconventional leading lady. But it was questionable right from the start, even if Jane Alexander's talents spoke for themselves, what kind of movie roles would be suitable for her in the long run.
One thing that is so marvelous about you is because of your face, the way it is, you can make it up to be very, very glamorous or become very, very
homely.
plain.
I know.
And I think that's an advantage.
I do too. Thank you. I've always felt it was an advantage, and when I first was doing movies, they tried to convince me to change my face and do a lot of things to my, and I said, no.
What do you mean change your face?
Oh, fix my nose and bleach my hair and do things like that. And I said, no. I said, this is all going to be very valuable. Don't do that. I said, it allows me to play all kinds of characters, which is true.
What also made Jane Alexander's Oscar nomination interesting for news outlets was the fact that her nomination came in the Best Actress category, while her Tony Award had been for Best Featured Actress. There could be the obvious explanation that 1970 was a weak year for leading actresses, and the studio therefore decided to take a risk and push Jane Alexander for leading, like it had happened in 1963 with Patricia Neal, but unlike Patricia Neal, nobody actually doubted Jane Alexander's category placement at the Oscars. It could therefore be that the movie, with its lesser runtime and stronger focus on the relationship between Jack and Eleanor, made her character a larger overall presence compared to the stage version. However, reading contemporary reviews, it appears that this is a case when the category at the Oscars was actually considered the right one, and Jane Alexander's supporting placement at the Tony Awards as the wrong one. The Tonys determine category placement by the billing of the performers. If you are billed below the title, you are placed in the featured category. It's a rule that might help to prevent category fraud sometimes, but on the other hand also gave us wins like Maureen Stapleton as Best Featured Actress in a Play for playing Serafina in The Rose Tattoo, yes, that's the Anna Magnani role, or Tammy Grimes for Best Featured Actress in a Musical, in The Unsinkable Molly Brown as none other than Molly Brown.
It is the titular role! No.
And it also determined that Jane, who was billed below the title in contrast to James Earl Jones, could only win the Tony for Featured Actress. But in the eventual movie version, billed more equally with James, her placement in the leading category was no problem and unsurprising. However, leading or supporting, Jane Alexander, like many other actresses during this period, was not too impressed with the Academy Awards. It doesn't mean that much. It's a very commercial thing, and it's not really fair anyway. The only way it would be fair would be to have several actresses play the same role, and then judge which of them did it best. And I mean, yes, that's probably true, but in the end, judging these performances is the point of my videos, so let's take a closer look at Jane's nominated performance in The Great White Hope. As is always the case when talking about a piece of work by an actress who had only worked on the stage so far, the first question is, has the performance been adjusted for the camera? Thankfully, the answer is positive. Jane Alexander herself felt that playing a very introvert character was helpful for her to learn about movie acting, but even in her louder moments, she takes to the camera like a pro, and her work never feels stagey or artificial. Instead, she always comes across as a believable creation, a woman who wants to avoid attention while realizing that everything she does is examined by the entire country, and in her quietness, an appealing opposite to James Earl Jones' much louder and present work.
Jack, stop it.
What?
Please.
I just fools when I wants to, hun.
All these people.
Where I wants to and how, yeah?
Baby, this for
Who asked you? So goddamn touchy about people looking you anymore to be here.
I don't like people looking when you're this way, Jack.
Oh, you don't? Well, I don't either, but I'm stuck with it and you ain't, so anything.
The nomination for Jane Alexander was not completely groundbreaking, as Elizabeth Hartman had already played a woman in love with a black man. But the premise of the story was, of course, that Selina was blind and did not recognize the color of Sidney Poitier's skin. In this aspect, Jane Alexander's nomination was remarkable and noteworthy, as it is the first time that a white nominee so openly talks about her feelings for a black man. Feelings that Jane Alexander, despite the introvert nature of her character, never tries to hide.
I'm not ashamed of wanting Jack for a lover. I wanted him that way.
Of course you did. And he would want you.
Why? Because I'm white.
No. I just meant that any man would be proud.
Mr. Cameron, I'm proud that he wanted me. Is that clear?
This groundbreaking aspect of Jane Alexander's nomination was, however, barely discussed in the weeks leading up to the Oscars. Maybe, as already mentioned, because there was a sense that these kinds of messages were not necessary or new anymore, but maybe also because the character often feels too withdrawn and secondary to truly make this kind of important statement. The Great White Hope as a movie might focus more strongly on the love story than the play, but it still never feels like a movie about a couple, but always about Jack and the different aspects of his life, with the relationship to Eleanor being one of them. The placement of Jane Alexander as a leading actress feels right, as her presence is relevant throughout the entire movie, but even in scenes that involve her, she always takes a step back, disappears into the background, or quite simply lacks the necessary energy to feel more relevant to the overall story. Jane Alexander's calm approach to Eleanor is not overshadowed by James Earl Jones' Titanic screen presence, but it just feels somewhat unexciting.
Are you feeling all right?
I'm feeling no different.
You sure?
Yeah.
You ate all those clams. Maybe you're
Hey,
getting some...
what you doing that for? I ain't got no fever.
You look a little peculiar, Jack.
Oh. Yeah, kind of ashy, you mean?
Yes, it's sort of funny.
Baby, that's not sick. That's how I get sunburned.
Jane Alexander is always a very intellectual actress with visible intelligence on the screen. Eleanor is certainly not meant to be dumb in any way, but it is a part that is more defined by its emotions. But this emotional aspect too seldom comes alive in her work. The chemistry between her and James Earl Jones works very well, and it's certainly commendable that they did not try to give some kind of high school romance angle to their relationship, but it does feel too cold in certain moments, which does make sense in the end, but not in the beginning, and it occasionally makes you wonder why Eleanor is so determined to keep following Jack until the end.
What will we do, Jack?
I don't know yet.
Do you think maybe we should go back to the hotel?
I said I don't know yet.
All right, I heard you.
However, there is no denying that Jane Alexander is an intriguing screen presence. Her sad face works very well to display constant worry and loneliness, even when she is with Jack, sensing that she might never truly belong to his world. The movie clearly gives more focus to the struggles of Jack, but Eleanor is caught in an equal situation where she is rejected by essentially everyone she meets, and finally even by Jack himself.
Oh, Jack, if you want other girls,
Hey, get your stuff ready. Train's out 10 o'clock.
No, I won't, no.
Dick, come here, give you a hand.
Jack!
Well, you just better stop moving.
You stop this.
Jane Alexander cannot completely overcome the stagey direction of her big final moments, as well as the distracting styling of the character, but she handles the scene with heartbreaking clarity, showing a woman who felt that this relationship was most likely destined to fail, but still completely overwhelmed and helpless when it finally does.
Boom, goddammit!
Why can't you wait at least and give me one chance to make you happy? Only one. I swear I've never had one.
It's too big all around, huh?
I won't go.
Uh-huh. You want to drag it out, huh?
I won't. I can't.
I'm gonna wise you up real good now, you great bitch.
Well, you can't make me go.
It's the portrayal of a woman who understands the grander implications of her love, but is unwilling to comprehend them. Occasionally, this makes it seem less like a relationship trapped in the wrong time, but simply like a relationship between two wrong people. But Jane Alexander's work is intense and gripping enough in various moments to make her character more than just a plot device, and might provide the movie with its single best moment.
And you look at this detective and you say,
"You slimy, two-bit, no-dick mother grabber." Now, that came up, these were the days. The movie came out in 1970, I think, 71. And those were the days that we had, remember censorship, guys? We don't have so much of that anymore. But anyway, the censor said, no, we can't have that line in there. And I think it was Richard Zanuck Jr., who was the producer at 20th Century Fox, said, "Oh, no, she means no dick means no detective. You slimy two-bit no detective mother grabber." So the censor said, "Oh yeah, okay, let it go."
For Jane Alexander, The Great White Hope was a remarkable piece of history and theater and film to be involved with for so many years. And even if it didn't bring her an Oscar, she was completely aware that the nomination and the sudden exposure to a nationwide audience clearly influenced her further career. As she said about herself and co-star James Earl Jones, "We both received Academy Award nominations. We felt extremely fortunate that happened. For our careers, it was seminal." Still, Jane Alexander did not aim to have a big movie career. Movies are fine, but you can't grow in Hollywood. You need a live audience to tell you what they like or don't like, what is good and what is bad. And yes, doing The Great White Hope on a movie set was clearly different for her from doing it on stage and experiencing the reactions of the audience every night. Instead, Jane Alexander preferred to not commit herself to a certain medium, always going where the material met her demands. Her first movie after The Great White Hope was the western A Gunfight, which received mostly negative reviews but was noteworthy for being the first movie financed by a tribe of Native Americans. Overall, Jane Alexander only made 9 movies from The Great White Hope to Testament, a period that brought her 4 Oscar nominations but still kept her profile rather low compared to other actresses at the same time. She has a lasting and impactful career on the stage, the screen and on television, playing roles that range from Calamity Jane to Queen Elizabeth II to Eleanor Roosevelt. But during the 80s, she would also complain that she was not able to compete with other actresses of her era, specifically pointing to Meryl Streep and Jane Fonda as women who reached their prime when audiences became interested in stronger female characters. And yes, it is true that, for all of her career, Jane Alexander was never considered a star, but despite her leading status in many projects, a character actress, a dependable and reliable performer who had obvious amounts of talents but never became a household name. But even if she maybe didn't have box office, Jane Alexander always had respect from her peers and a varied and remarkable career that gave us many outstanding and memorable portrayals of strength, dignity and preservation.
I certainly was asked to be a part of a lot of projects, if you will, that were socially relevant. And I was drawn to the roles, you're right. First of all, very often they're really fine roles because they're a hero's journey kind of role. And who doesn't want to play those great roles, you know?
And it was this respect for her intelligence and dedication that led to her appointment to chair of the National Endowment of the Arts by President Clinton in 1993. And again, she treated this position with the same seriousness as everything else in her life, practically ending her acting career for the next couple of years.
"You're gonna fund pornography?" His question to me was flung out like a glove slapping the ground. I rose weakly to the challenge and responded that the National Endowment for the Arts did not fund obscenity, that obscenity was considered unprotected speech. He said he didn't care what the endowment did, he wanted to know what I thought. I said, somewhat grandly, that I was an artist, that as an artist nothing human was alien to me.
Additionally, Jane Alexander always spoke out for nuclear disarmament, serves on the board of the Wildlife Conservative Society and fought for LGBTQ rights at a time when it was still a risk to do so, appearing with Gina Rowlands in the TV movie A Question of Love, about a lesbian couple in a custody battle way back in 1978.
If Mike goes ahead with this thing and we decide to fight it, we're going to have to go into court. In public. Newspapers. Do you know what that could mean?
Oh, it could mean nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Young and old, black and white, gay and straight, progressive and conservative. We are as diverse as the rainbow of human experience. A democracy celebrates all of its citizens, protecting any minority from the tyranny of a majority.
And while she was always a woman clearly aware of the problems in our society, she would also never give up hope. It was surprising to me, the number of white people who wondered, why did you have to do that for your first film? I was thrilled. Race relations were different at that time. We didn't march in the same way. If you look at the marches in Selma, Alabama, you won't see a lot of white people. But now we have Black Lives Matter, and there are a lot of white people and black people walking side by side. That's progress.
I know the arc of controversy. I understand it. I have been that artist who was caught up in that controversy. I know that the arts somehow cushion the shock and that today's controversies become tomorrow's culture.